I want to discuss Cuba, if you can imagine all things. You know, Senator Rubio, not enough has been said. We take a step back and look at history. At the media's role of installing this communist regime in Cuba, particularly a guy by the name of Herbert Matthews, particularly the New York Times, and they seem to have no care or responsibility for what they've helped create in Cuba. Still very sympathetic to the communist regime there, as I hate to say, as are many of the people in the leading positions of the Democrat Party. What do you make of this?
Well, you're right. I mean, people aren't aware of it. You know, Fidel Castro was a liar from the beginning. When he was in the Sierra Maestra as a guerrilla, they covered him, they romanticized him. The gentleman you mentioned romanticized him. They wrote a series of articles intended to influence American public opinion. He said he was a Democrat. He said he was going to have elections and things. He actually used to use religious symbolism to sort of make people think that he was, you know, a Christian-like figure and so forth. And then obviously it all changed. He became an avowed Marxist and anti-American, almost started a nuclear holocaust with the Cuba Missile Crisis, and obviously has been a source of instability all over the world. I mean, Cubans were involved in Angola and in multiple countries in Africa. They've been involved in all the destabilization in the Western Hemisphere. They've committed horrific crimes, not just against their own people. They've killed civilian pilots. The Brothers to the Rescue were shot down in 1996, unarmed civilian aircraft who were searching for rafters and trying to save them. So it's been a horrible thing, and you're right about the coverage. I mean, even to this day, you get some ridiculous coverage about how great their healthcare system is, or how their literacy rate is so high, and how evil the United States is, and how the embargo has imposed all of this terrible pain on them, completely ignoring that the only embargo in Cuba is the one the regime has against its own people. If a private, it's one of the key points of the Trump policy towards Cuba. If a private Cuban is allowed to open a business, we can trade in commerce with them. We just can't trade in commerce with entities owned by the Communist Party, the Marxist regime of Cuba, and that's the right policy.
What do you make of the support for this regime? I mean, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I mean, the nation was almost unified in its objection to that regime. Certainly, in the 60s, the Democrat Party was absolutely appalled by that regime. I don't see the same sense of morality and concern. I see parts of the Democrat Party, the so-called squad, which are cheering for Castro the way they were cheering for Hamas, the way they cheer against the United States. This is growing in this country. Don't you get that sense?
Well, it's certainly growing as a vibrant constituency inside the Democratic Party. I mean, if you look at who raises the money, who knocks on the doors, what's their activist base, it is, unfortunately, for the country, basically neo-Marxists, New Age Marxists. They don't call themselves that, but that's what they stand for, who also happen to be whatever is America is for. So there's a problem in the world, some suffering somewhere, Cuba or anywhere else for that matter. There's some U.S. policy that's causing it, something we've done wrong. Because remember, at the core of one of their arguments that these Marxists make is that America is an inherently evil nation, founded by inherently evil men, built on an inherently evil foundation, and therefore this is not a nation worth saving. This is a nation that needs to be torn down and rebuilt alongside some other image that they have for the country. So I think there's a lot of that embedded in it. And then part of it is, look, if you're a socialist, if you're a Marxist, you look at Cuba and you say, okay, we don't like the fact they put people in jail and beat up protesters, but generally what they're trying to do over there is the right thing. Government sponsored this and government provided that. I think for us, Cuba is an example of what Marxism always wants. Marxism wants to keep people poor. Socialism wants to keep people poor because poor people are easier to control. You can use food, you can use medicine, you can use jobs, you can use education as leverage over them to get them to do what you want them to do. And I think that's a powerful lesson to take away from Cuba, from Venezuela, Nicaragua, and anywhere else where Marxism and socialism reigns.
President of the United States, Joe Biden, was slow to respond. You had people rising up. They didn't have weapons. They were just marching in the streets. They had speech, even though they don't have free speech. I mean, they were really putting their lives on the line. And they were not just mostly peaceful, they were 100% peaceful. And the thugs, the secret police, come out and brutalize them. They drag people off, some of whom are still missing. They shut down bloggers, they shut down journalists. And I hear almost nothing coming out of the executive branch, not just the White House, but almost nothing coming out of the executive branch. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's evidence of a couple things. First of all, it took Joe Biden 24 hours to even speak about it. And then their initial messages about it sort of indicates what's happening, okay? The people in charge of Cuba policy, which has not been a priority for Biden, or the Western Hemisphere for that matter. But the people in charge of Cuba policy are people that have a long history of advocating for more engagement with the regime. In fact, the people running Cuba policy in the National Security Council and at the State Department are people that were very involved in the Obama opening towards Cuba, which was a total disaster, as admitted by some of the people who drew it up, by the way. So I think that's the first thing, is their initial reaction was, yeah, they're protesting, but it's because they don't have vaccines, which, by the way, the Cuban government won't allow in. It's because they're hungry, because the embargo is not allowing them to prosper. They're just hitting tough economic times. So this is the fault of the Trump sanctions and the fault of COVID. That was their initial reaction. Then they pivoted to just sort of a condemnation of it, generally speaking. And then Biden actually had a pretty good statement. Socialism has failed. Marxism has failed. Cuba is a failed state. We want to provide more internet. We stand with the people. But a couple of days later, they come out with a statement that what we're going to do in Cuba is we're going to figure out a way for relatives to send more money to their relatives on the island of Cuba, leaving out completely, A, that that's not what the protesters are asking for, B, that the vast majority of people in Cuba, or the overwhelming majority, do not get money from anyone abroad, and C, that the reason why money can't go there is because the regime has set up some bank in Panama which controls it. You have to send it to that bank. They take 10%. They keep the dollars. They convert those dollars into a worthless Cuban currency. They steal it. And Trump said enough of that. So they leave all that out. So what I make of it is the people in charge of Cuba policy in this administration are not in favor of being tougher on the regime. And frankly, I think prefer to have stability in Cuba than liberty in Cuba.